As usual, we will kickstart off, probably just 1 minute past the hour so that many people can sort themselves out, take their last bite of their lunch before they settle down for a fun-filled hour on complaints and RCA.
Setting an expectation there.
I know. It's on the record, it's been recorded. And so, and if you want to steal a march on the many people who signed up for this webinar, why don't you just post a question in the chat if you want that to be addressed or answered quickly as possible. We've got loads of you on this call. So if you want to share your question with everybody, you can post it in the chat. Alternatively, you can post it anonymously through the Q&A, which is denoted by the 2 speech bubbles at the top of your toolbar there. It is literally first come, first served on this webinar this month. We got a staggering 1,700 people registering for this webinar, but we've only got 1,000 slots. So if you're one of those 1,000, welcome to this webinar. If you're not, then you have to get the recording, which we will send over to you if you're watching this on demand, alongside a PDF version of the slides. So let's get going, and welcome to this Elephants Don't Forget webinar, where together with our colleagues from Aptean as well as Avyse, review the FCA's December 2024's publication on complaints and root cause analysis, good practice and areas for improvement. I think they could have done with a shorter title, but anyway, no matter. Our aim is for the next 60 minutes is not to necessarily regurgitate chapter and verse of the report, but give you an idea and a steer in the right direction towards what good looks like. And thankfully, it's just not me doing that. We're joined by Martin Camwell from Aptean, Kate Robinson from Avyse Partners. Welcome back to you both on this webinar series, and also Adrian Harvey, CEO of Elephants Don't Forget. Normal rules, procedures apply in this webinar. We love your interactions and engagement, so we'll be asking you a series of poll questions, as well as actually trying to answer as many questions as possible throughout the hour that we've got. And we're going to cover off these 4 key bullet points that you signed up to. But if there's anything else you want to cover off, because, hey, you know what? We're here for you. Yeah. Then please do let us know. But we're going to cover off these in a bit more detail, which is meeting regulatory expectations, identifying and addressing root causes beyond policies, systems and controls, capturing high quality real-time data and ensuring that data drives action and better and improved decision making. Look, because record numbers have been on this, registered for this webinar, obviously you have prioritized compliance over kids, which I do respect, by the way. And also we're going for the record. We're going for more downloads and more impressions and more click pages than Love Island All Stars, which apparently, according to my daughter, concluded yesterday. So good on you. Well done for doing that. So we're going to kickstart our webinar off with a poll question. I don't know why that was a laugh. Anyway, let's kickstart our first poll question there, which of the following factors does your firm most often identify as root causes of poor customer outcomes? There, we've got a few questions. These are multiple choice answers that you can populate there. Which of the following factors does your firm most often identify as root causes of poor customer outcomes there? Kate, whilst people populate that, I'm just wondering what your feedback on the complaints landscape has been since the ushering in of Consumer Duty 18 months or 19 months ago there. Where do things stand?
Yeah, afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. I think from my perspective, Consumer Duty hasn't led to an increase in complaints, but what it has done is really put the spotlight on the quality of firms complaint handling processes and root cause analysis. So there's no surprises really why FCA have kind of chosen this topic as one of their first thematics under the Consumer Duty review. It's got lots of lovely links in terms of foreseeable harm, which is why the Consumer Duty is in place at the moment, as well as links to, you know, target market, fair value, good customer support and understanding, which we'll explore in a little bit more detail as we go through that RCA process this afternoon.
And certainly, Martin, life is tough for some sectors, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, I mean, definitely what we see some root causes of complaints, has been addressed since Consumer Duty has been implemented. But of course, there are some big things that are going on at the moment, particularly if you're in the car finance space and the consumer credit space. And this has presented a real challenge for these firms in terms of how they handle those complaints, how they handle that volume. You can't handle it necessarily as business as usual. So, firms are reaching out and looking for help and support in terms of how they're going to handle these things in the sort of short and medium term.
And judging by the poll results, Adrian, some firms are going to need to gear up and actually additional support and upskill and reskill some of their frontline staff in response to those challenges in particular sectors.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I'm going to be talking to the people agenda in this topic, and one of the things I'm not proud of it, but back in the day when I was running a business called British Gas, we had systems, processes, procedures, policies. We'd spent a lot of money. We spent £500 million on a billing system, and we got a lot of complaints. So even if you've got all of the allegedly perfect processes, policies, and procedures, the people component is often a massive driver of complaints in your organization. And most firms actually fail to identify the actual extent to which an employee's competence drove that, or rather lack of, drove that complaint. And we'll go on to unpick that a little bit more in terms of their lack of competence also failed to correctly codify the root cause of that complaint, such that the resulting management information was useless or coalesced around a fluffy subject like it was the customer's fault.
Hey, when you look at this, these results from our first poll question there, does that surprise you in terms of like the factors displayed? Also in the chat, there's a few factors there that were mentioned by individuals. Thank you for that, by the way. Kate, percentage-wise, 64% combination of systematic errors, issues, individual errors, training gaps, and 27% individual employee errors. That's a nod to Adrian's points there. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's perhaps how I would expect firms to respond. So I think it's where it becomes really interesting is, can you as a business identify then what are the systemic issues? Where are the group of individuals who perhaps need additional training, to Adrian's point, and what are those specific training gaps, rather than re-rolling out something else? So that's kind of linked to that, keeping it linked to that RCA point, so that root cause analysis point. But it's a common trend when we go into businesses and look at, okay, let's look at your root cause analysis document. We'll often see those three highlighted as their key root cause analysis points. Obviously, with systemic issues, it might be related to a particular system or a particular issue that is bespoke to a company. I think what gets really interesting is what's then unpacked beneath those. So if there is a system issue, is that because the methodology of how the system was written and derived is fundamentally wrong, and it's getting to that real root cause? And that's what FCA are looking for with this paper. It's not just saying, okay, so yeah, we've got a system issue, it means delays. Actually, does that system issue derive the right methodology for you to get to the right solution for the customer in terms of the service and the product that you're offering?
Unpack that a little more detail. I love that viewpoint. Martin, you would see obviously and resonate with a number of those points that Kate has raised there, and systems and implementation of systems, but also the application of those systems in the appropriate way to answer a few key questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that just speaks to just how multi-threaded these issues are, and how, companies have got to consider and potentially implement a range of solutions in order to change a metric. I've seen and experienced, senior leaders that think that there's one silver bullet that's going to fix an issue, right? And it's just not the case. So, you need that very competent root cause analysis, that ability to get down and, understand those different threads. And as we'll speak to further on, just how do you implement and actually track the effect of that change?
And when we look at those changes that are needed and required, Kate, you're looking at the poll results here when we asked to what extent does your firm's RCA process consider factors beyond immediate causes. Firms, 46% consider some systematic and underlying factors. 26 focus primarily on immediate causes.
Yeah.
25% thoroughly investigate systems and underlying factors. You work closely with the regulator. What would they say about these results?
I think it's probably reflective of why they've issued this paper in the first place. I think one of the, and we'll talk about it a little bit later in terms of governance, but one of the real common issues I see is firms reporting a complaints rate, let's say at 10% or lower, and then there is an acceptance that that is the complaints rate. And as a result, there isn't any detailed RCA sitting underneath it, because that's the way it's always been and that's the way it always is, and you will always have people complaining. Whereas I think what the regulator's asking firms to do at the moment is to question a little bit more, and bringing in that foreseeable harm point from Consumer Duty, it's to really get to grips. So even if you've got a 1% rate, there needs to be some form of RCA that you can evidence that actually, do you know what, we're going to have a 5-10% complaints rate. We've delivered really nice RCA around it. We're confident that's the right metric, and this is now our risk appetite. And if that changes, either gets higher or lower, we'll do another root cause analysis on that basis.
That's the theory. Hopefully that's also some of the practice. But Adrian, 25% only thoroughly investigating underlying factors like culture.
Yeah. I given that I'm speaking to the people agenda, because I've got two experts talking to the rest of the agenda, and I don't add any value really. I'm just going to introduce this concept of a metric that our customers use in their world, but most of the people on the call won't, and that's a numerical measurement of employee competence. And we use it as a KPI. And I see quite a lot of chats, thank you very much in the chat, that's really helpful, and it informs us greatly, around, we train our people, we do this, and actually that approach is perhaps, and we'll hopefully unpick it in this webinar, not particularly helpful in the scheme of things. Yeah, if you're taking a really detailed approach to root cause analysis, you are going to be able to track back the extent to which an individual employee's competence fueled that complaint. And that's where you need to be. And we've got one of these slides talks about granularity. And to Martin's point, you really need to be able to get to that level of granularity to fix the problem. There is no silver bullet.
And so when we look at the review, as I said, we're not going to go root and branch through the review itself, but let's give a high level understanding of what the review was and what the review achieved. And perhaps going to you, Martin, first, and then Kate second. What did you take away from the review before we dive into the details? So Kate, 40 firms across lots of sectors, and also asking some key questions around accountability, governance, around complaints, how the complaints were made, and when were the complaints made, and how were they dealt with, and not just recognition of how they dealt with, how was the follow-through action, therefore subsequent action and fed through there. What was your key findings of observations of that, Kate, and then we'll go to you, Martin.
Yeah, and I think this is interesting that they're really focused on root cause analysis, because for once, when you look at any of the FCA rule books, whichever one you're looking at, complaints is actually probably the most granular in terms of prescriptive detail of what's expected for firms. You know, there is a 4-week rule, an 8-week rule, but then within that complaints handbook, there's one really key rule, which is firms must do root cause analysis. And that's pretty much all it says. So this paper is really the FCA saying to everyone, listen, this is what we expect of you in order to be able to deliver against this rule. And they've set it out really clearly. And I think what they're saying is, you know, fundamentally, we're going to talk through each of these steps as we go through, but it's really about having that base level understanding of management information, making sure you've got clear record, as always. If it's not written down, it never happened. And then taking that data and completing some sensible root cause analysis where you can show really clearly that you've got a nice feedback loop from complaint entering the business to the board recognising it to some sort of action taking place.
Martin, you must be rubbing your hands saying, this is what I've been talking about all this time.
Yeah, you're not wrong. So, I mean, I talked to some people about why this webinar was so important, and I think, you know, it is that area where people have felt very unclear as to what is expected. You know, to Kate's point, there's real clarity elsewhere, but there's just a kind of a one-liner in this. So I think the FCA have done a really good job in terms of, you know, sharing what they like, what they think is missing. I think it helps people develop you know, an action plan and assess their own root cause analysis function to identify what the gaps are, ask themselves some difficult questions, and people will see throughout this pack and this presentation, you know, we've given people a head start on that. So yeah, it's the first time I think people have really sort of seen something that helps them take some real practical action to, you know, to close the gap that they knew was there, but they didn't know how big it was, and they didn't know what shape it was.
Mm-hmm.
So let's kick off, Kate, with robust management information. And just so you understand how we've unpacked this webinar over the next 7 slides, is that we've got on the left-hand side the blockers. So what will stop good practices or leading practices in the industry from happening? So our panelists are going to flag those blockers on the left-hand side there. We're going to give you in the middle column action steps. So what do you need to do differently? And these are key considerations. Some of those are gleaned from the report itself, but others are the insights and understanding of our colleagues on the panel. And then the right-hand side is the questions that you probably want to actually download and keep in terms of like posing to yourself as well as other colleagues in the business there. So MI good practice, kick us off, Kate.
Yeah, so I think, you know, as Philip says, we're going to talk through these. I think the one I'd like to focus on right at the start is policy and procedures. So dependent on your type of firm, there will have been a huge amount of work, I'm sure, to kind of uplift your framework to meet consumer duty expectations. And what we see when we go into firms is there's lots of different parts of that framework being touched, but sometimes the complaints policy and procedure bit has been left alone. And I think this is the most important part of the framework to link to that consumer duty framework. So I would have the two sitting together. And I think what you want to do is have really, really clear distinction between what is policy. So what are the rules that apply to your business and why? And then what is procedure, which is how are you going to make sure you follow those rules? And that procedure bit, where firms sometimes get unstuck, is it's really not clear. It needs to be simple, clear, plain English, easy to follow steps that will ensure that those that are responsible for identifying a complaint know what to do and when. And then the actual complaints department itself, if you have one, or it might just be one individual, has a really clear process to follow when working through that complaint to resolution and building in what we expect from root cause analysis.
And riffing off that point, Martin, it's no point in actually tacking on, is there, your RCA to your board reports anymore. That won't fly.
No, absolutely. No, there's a clear expectation that this is going to deliver action, deliver some change that actually impacts the outcomes for customers. And I think that's the gap that exists at the moment, not just in complaints root cause. I think we see it in customer experience as well. I think that insight to action gap exists. It's very difficult to agree the change, get ownership for that change, implement it, and then track it. But that's the point of all of this at the end of the day, is to actually lead to meaningful change to customers.
And when we talk about high level analysis, point number 3 on the left hand side on the first column there, Adrian, how much visibility do firms have on their people?
Well, it really depends on what glasses they're wearing. I happen to be wearing my brand new pink ones at the moment that give me perfect vision. I think depending on who you are in the firm, quite a lot of people are perhaps overly comfortable in the quality of their MI relating to their employees. We track this, we track it all the time, and we know that our employees are super competent. What I know for a fact over the last decade, every time we socialize our AI called Clevernelli in a firm, the average level of competence is 54%. We've done 200 million of these for the last 10 years, right? It's a pretty consistent data point, and that's using the firm's own yardstick. So it's not using a foreign yardstick, it's using the firm's own quality measures. So what I found when I ran, admittedly, very big businesses was there was a requirement to put a system in place and simplify that system. And in that simplification, we lost the truth. And we ended up with a generic, we've done this, we followed a process, and therefore everyone is competent because we've done it. And we know that's not how it works. And we can unequivocally prove it, and so can our customers. So I would question the quality of the management information. It's all very well, garbage in, garbage out. I'm not saying it's garbage, but that old phrase, what are you relying on? How robust is that management information in relation to people? I would suggest if you're not doing it daily, you're not doing it at an individual person level, and you're not taking humans and bias out of the equation, it's not very accurate.
Yeah. I think the only thing to add to that is around that quality of stuff, is also around the quality of your actual complaints department. So if you do have a team of people, the expectation on those individuals is they know every part of the business just as well as the individual working in that part of the business. It's a big ask. Overlay compliance rules and consumer duty. I think FCA's expectation of complaints handling staff has increased significantly. If we look at kind of borrowers in financial difficulty and the focus that the FCA gave to that part of the market, what we've seen as a result is those staff that are handling those conversations are generally now being paid more, and they are better skilled to handle. There's been a recognition that those conversations are difficult to have, and you need an additional skill set to deliver good quality conversations. I think the same is about to happen in complaints handling teams, because those teams have kind of been often overlooked for a little bit of time, rightly or wrongly so. But you're asking a lot from the individual here. You're asking them to be a data analyst. You're asking them to know all the rules to say what's right and wrong in terms of management of a complaint. You're asking them to be able to determine how much a customer should be awarded for payment. It's a lot to ask from a group of people.
Kate, it's such a good point. I don't know if you saw it in the chat, but someone actually raised that very point to say we don't pay our people enough, and it's like a washing machine. They come in, they go out, rinse and repeat. And it's shocking, really, and it is a fact of life. But I think you're right. I think firms will catch up, and they'll recognise this is actually a highly skilled position. It's also a highly stressful position.
It is, yeah. And I think those that are joined today and who are working in complaints departments, this is a real key message to take to your boards right now, in terms of, whilst you're being asked to do more with less constantly, just remind them of the importance of your department and its value in terms of the broader proposition. It's really, really key moving forward.
Hey, Valentine's Day is over. Stop with the love hearts. Come on, look, can we move on?
I can't keep pressing this heart as quick as I am without it showing.
Our fingers are getting sore, aren't they, Martin?
Okay.
Right. Oh, come on.
Look at that.
For the audience now. Martin, talk to us about, is what we know about our people enough? Is what we know about our people enough?
I'm feeling the pressure now with that much love on the last point. It's
You said people are going to have fun, Philip.
Exactly. This granularity point. This is funny. This is a real challenge for people. So, how do I, when collecting data, do that in a way in which I present options to my colleagues that are specific enough and meaningful enough that I can do something with, but versus not presenting so many options that actually I just can't complete it. And I'm just going to go for the top 3 because that's all I've got the time to do. And then the back end of that is a challenge as well. So how do I present this data in a way that's meaningful to senior leaders, that's specific enough that they can understand what's going on, but also isn't reams and reams and reams of tables and data that they just simply can't get to, and also ends up, oh, that looks like a very small volume of things, so it looks like something we don't need to do anything about. So the real challenge for people, I think, is selecting those categories that really help them to identify, where the most, where harm is most likely to sit. The FCA is called out, vulnerable customers. That's one area. There'll be others as well. So you've got to prioritize those things where there is likely to be the most harm, because you're not going to be able to do everything. You're not going to be able to capture everything. So, how do you focus? How do you prioritize? But it's a real challenge.
And in terms of Kate, when you look at, there is an expectation to measure outcomes across different target markets, different audiences, different groups of people there, and that's a good sense check though internally as well. To see whether you are delivering good outcomes.
Absolutely a great sense check, and I think this is like the starting point for good root cause analysis, making sure you sat down, and not just the complaints team, the broader business, to work out, right, which categories do we want to have to be able to sort our complaints into, is like the first step. And it's taking that end-to-end customer journey, right from your financial promotions through to your customer exiting your business, and looking at, right, okay, these are the categories that we're going to have, because all too often when we go in and we do an investigation, whether it be for the regulator or a firm's asked us to come in and look at their process, I will say to them, let's take an industry that's had quite a lot of complaints, let's say the loan industry, and I will say, right, okay, so how many of these complaints about your loans are about the product itself, and how many are about the type of service? And they will just say, oh, well, these are all about high cost short-term credit, these complaints. And then I haven't got that granularity. So my expectation would be to say, right, well, okay, which are affordability complaints, which are forbearance complaints, and then which are service level complaints. So based on kind of time or staff, I would split it into. And then the next layer, because you could play with this data for ages, and that's where I get quite excited, because I could spend hours looking at different ways to cut it. But if you start at that high level from your business process point of view, and then overlay, what I would do is your key customer outcomes from Consumer Duty. So is this about our target market? So can I split my complaints data by my target market? So an example would be is, if I'm aiming for a target market demographic of aged, I don't know, younger generation, let's say 18 to 35, are all my complaints coming in from 18 to 35-year-olds? Or actually, is it my complaints are being generated by an audience that this product wasn't intended for in the first place? And how do I go and fix that? Because that's going to be my root cause. So that's your target market. And then the other bit is your fair value. If customers are complaining about something, the likelihood is that there is an issue with the value of what you are charging for your product. And we've seen it in the insurance industry time and time again. Complaints around claims, whether that's around service level handling or the amount of money that the customer is getting paid out, often both of those stem back to fair value, because if you've got a customer buying a product and the benefit of that product is that they will get a payment if something goes wrong, and that payment is either delayed or too little, FCA are going to come in and question your fair value, and you don't want them doing that. And then the third part, I would say the second two parts are kind of that customer support and understanding. So if you take those 4 outcomes and overlay it against your business process, you'd be in a really nice position as a starting point for that granular level analysis, as the regulator would expect.
Yeah, and that's name checked, that able to slice and dice that data is name checked in the report, actually, and there's a quite a nice example of that where one firm has done that. Adrian, there's nothing wrong with geeking out on data, especially when data around your people, is there?
Yeah, okay, so you can have far too much data and you can fail to see the wood for the trees, and you can end up just analysing till the cows come home, right? So I particularly like the way Kate's cut through that really simplistically, and with full respect, Kate, yeah, and look at this through the regulator's lens. I'm just going to pick up a point from the past where I ran a business, actually at Eon, where we had engineers visiting customers' houses, and would look at complaints, and this is an absolute call out to the competence of the individual handling the call, not the complaints handler necessarily. We had a separate complaints function, but they had to deal with the information that was captured on the system. And the customer might say, it's the engineer's fault. He didn't fix it, the engineer, he's rubbish. So the complaint might go logged against an engineer, whereas in reality, if the person had sufficient competence and confidence and the support of their leadership to ask the next question, to say, so, Mr. Avyse, I appreciate you're busy and you're upset, but can you just tell me what actually went wrong? Oh, he didn't have any parts. That's not the engineer's fault. That's scheduling's fault. So it gets codified as engineering. Everyone expects engineering to be shit, so everyone believes the hype. That it is definitely engineering, and we shovel loads of money into fixing that, and actually, it's scheduling. So we're fixing the wrong problem. So this granularity point, this point about ensuring that all staff, not just the specialist staff, all staff have the confidence that stems from competence. Yeah, you know, obviously general customer competence, that's not very helpful, but genuine confidence stems from competence. And you are going to get much better outcomes if your employees are competent and therefore confident enough to ask the customer when the customer is triggered to elicit what it really was that caused that problem.
Yeah. Okay. Martin, when we talk about beyond identifying harm, one of the key aspects of the expectation from the regulator there, are firms doing enough to maximize the resource and the intel from their complaints and also from their RCA?
Yeah, and certainly it wouldn't appear so in terms of what the FCA have seen. I think, you know, we talk to customers and potential customers where there's still some...
Why is that then? Why is that then? If there's an expectation from the regulator and they're not doing, what is the blockage here?
So I think often you are caught up in the operational day-to-day. So one of the things the FCA called out is how, you know, the data is being used to help identify, you know, the number of colleagues that you need, you know, scheduling, resourcing, all of that kind of stuff. You know, people are trying to get work done. Where, you know, what departments and businesses aren't always resourced for is the taking, you know, looking further into that data, looking at the whys and trying to do something about it so that you can turn the tap off in the first place. And so you're just in that, you know, forever cycle of looking at data, just trying to keep on top of the volume that's coming in. So, you know, the people that, you know, do this best have been given time and space and resources to actually ask those questions. Why? What's causing this? What can we do about it? How can we turn off the tap in some aspects? And then how can we then, you know, reuse the resource that we're freed up from that to do more of that, you know, and end up in that kind of cycle instead. But that's very hard to do. And it takes a real commitment from senior leaders to fund and resource that to start with.
I tell you what I'm seeing, just to, I don't know if you can see it, Philip. What I'm seeing in the chat, recurring theme, is our leadership do not connect this function, complaint handling, as value adding. They see it as value destroying. They see it as a cost center, something to be managed down, lowest cost to do it, very little learnings, tick the box, move on.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a lot of that in the chat. And I mean, that's a sad indictment. And for me, Kate, it goes to the heart of consumer duty. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of people saying, well, what can I do? Maybe we cover that if we get to the end and we get some time for a bit of a chat. So I particularly like us to zone in on that because so many people are making this comment.
Yeah, I've got some nice ideas to help you on that as well. I think
So I want to pick up on point number 3 in the left-hand column there, insufficient collaboration there, because, and it probably leans on your point there, Adrian. I was surprised in the report that they were commending organisations whose complaints departments were talking to their compliance departments. Sorry, didn't I get the memo on that? I thought that happened anyway. Kate, Martin, is that normal? Why are you taking...
I don't know what's normal anymore, to be honest. I think this is the issue with complaints. You know, you can have a firm that has a couple of complaints a year, and you can have a firm that is in, let's say, the motor finance space at the moment, who is drowning in DSARs and complaints. And what's important, most important, is to articulate why your policy or your process in terms of what you decide to do is right for your business. So I would expect a very different approach from a firm that's getting 1, 2, 3 complaints versus a firm that's getting, you know, over 1,000 the day after Martin Lewis has been on telly and talked about something else as regards car finance. And sometimes it's harder for those that are getting the smaller numbers. One of the key things for firms that are getting smaller number of complaints is to make sure that FCA will come in and check, okay, if you've got a small number, you're almost in as red a zone as those that are getting a high number, because the way the regulator will look at it, they'll say, oh, hold on, does that mean that their customers are not being identified as complainants? Is there the right access channels? That's where you've got to focus your attention. Whereas the bigger firms, it shows by the numbers that your access channels are probably okay, but how are you then handling that from an RCA perspective?
Yes, yeah, I mean, some really good points made in the chat. Keep them coming, please. If there are any questions, we do promise to take them offline to answer them in a bit more detail there. Yes, the PDF version of the slides will be made available alongside the recording of only my jokes. I don't know about the rest of it, but and certainly my insights on this webinar will be recorded and posted out to you there. Martin, when we talk about quantifying success here, stop it again. Quantifying success here, regulators always talking about in their speeches and presentations, show, don't tell there. And this is critical for what reasons?
Yeah, well, it's evidence at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, so we actually need to be able to evidence what we've done and whether it's had an effect. And without that, then you can't assume that any change has happened whatsoever. But again, I think as we've spoken about earlier, you know, that takes time and effort and resources to do that, to invest in that level of analysis and tracking. It takes leaders within the business that care enough about it to want to see things implemented and understand whether they've had an effect or not. But without that, you've got nothing to show for all of the hard work that's going to be being done by somebody.
Yeah, I think there's 2 angles from this. There's absolutely the regulator wants to see what you've done, how you've done it, and what impact it's had. But the second point, just talking to that kind of broader point in terms of the value of complaints departments, this is your opportunity to show to the rest of the business how you are providing return on investment, and why you are a valuable function. So, and what I see more than often, too much, is a firm that said, all right, we've noticed, I don't know, a systemic issue in that we've got a number of affordability complaints coming in. Let's say they're from teenage drivers who want a car loan who are under 25. That's your group that you've identified as your complaints group. There's then a brilliant remediation plan put in place, really clear, really well documented. And then it's left. And what you don't see is the follow-on of, well, what was the impact of that? What was the change? You know, really focus in on the P&L. If you changed your lending policy as a result of a systemic complaint issue, how much does that save the business in money? Not how much has it reduced the number of complaints. It's about what's it done to the broader commercials of your firm? How have you helped manage and support that balance sheet as you move forward? That's what you've got to really push.
Yeah. Fair shout there. I want to just wrap up this point. I'm asking Adrian, because obviously we've got some key insights into NPS there, but having a single data point is great, but relying on NPS has its challenges, and that's not coming from us at Elephants, don't forget, is it?
No, it's coming from the founder who was on one of our webinars, who warned Fred, who's a fantastically clever chap, who warned people it's an imperfect measure. And I hope no one on this call is using a single point reference like NPS to guide them, because let's face it, what percentage of your total population is actually completing the NPS score? So I would suggest it's a subset. So immediately it is inherently biased, and who's to say it's representative? It just happens to be a data point. So I hate averages, and I find NPS by default an average of potentially not the right information.
Yes, and yeah, clarity of data is important, but also accountability and ownership here. And I'm going to name check an Aptean article there, which was produced and published by your colleague, Martin, just last year there. This is critical, isn't it? We talked about this slightly in a slightly different guise earlier on in the webinar, but ownership and accountability, being able to kind of like draw out where the buck stops and what the actions are from that person who's responsible for that, rather than designating. I know that in the chat briefly before the webinar, Kate, you pulled me up quite rightly saying, well, look, it's a team understanding, but actually sitting with the individual, you know, really sharpens the accountability angle, Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we keep saying, you know, it's the bit that's missing here. You know, it's the bit where people, you know, they're not taking ownership of the problem, not taking ownership of the solution. And without that, it's going to be just incredibly difficult to get change through. And I think we need to move away from this thing where it's, you know, complaints, you know, and the complaints number seems to be the problem of the complaints department. You know, it's not. They don't generate, they respond. You know, it's the business areas, it's the business functions, it's the sales, the marketing, the documentation that generates all of this. So until businesses kind of recognize that and take that pressure and expectation, yeah, I'm getting some love finally. Thank you, folks. Then
you have to work a bit harder than us.
Yeah, I know, right? I'm going to lap it all up. But yeah, until we move away from that and see the complaints function as something that is there to help those business functions to reduce those causes of complaints, then it's going to be incredibly difficult for the complaints function to have the influence that's expected of them.
When we come into looking at root cause analysis and best practices, probably like the word good practice, but let's go with best practice. It's picked up in the report in a bit of detail there, but there's a direct correlation, isn't there? Evidenced by by the Consumer Association in the UK, Adrian, that there's an inextricable link to employee engagement and your CSAT scores. For those who don't know, CSAT is customer satisfaction index there. So talk to us about the relationship between employee engagement, employee competence, and the result being increased customer satisfaction, because customer satisfaction levels are pretty poor at the moment, aren't they?
All-time record low in the UK. And there is a lot of data to support the fact that your most competent employees have the highest ESAT, employee satisfaction, and deliver the best service in your business. They also happen to be some of your most loyal employees. It's a really big positive thing, but it is a cultural thing that's got to be owned by the C-suite. So with respect, a lot of people on this call saying, I'm in a complaint. You're not going to influence that. Your leadership needs to own this and recognize that happy employees, happy customers, happy profits. If they don't buy that philosophy, with respect, you're not going to change the army from the bottom. You're going to change it from the top. So, and that's why I want to get to some time, Philip. I know we've got a few more slides, but I'm desperate. And you said this would finish at 43, and we were going to have a party, and we blasted through that, and we still got a few more slides. So chop chop.
And yes, I was that person in the army, tried to change it from the bottom. No, enough anyway. Right.
There's one thing I would just say on your RCA, two takeaway messages for firms. One, challenge yourself whether you've got the right type of staff to do it, because it is a different job to complaints handler, very different. So really, and ask for help if you're not sure. I think the second piece is match up your root cause analysis against your latest Dear CEO letter from the FCA. If you have not done that already, do that now, because that's where the regulator's going with this. They have picked out and told you where they think the root causes are in that Dear CEO letter. You should have an RCA profile that matches that Dear CEO letter.
100%, 100%. Nodding to time as well as urgency to move through and get to your questions and address those. Martin, just talk us through bullet point number 1, sharing is caring. No use keeping data to yourself, is there?
No, absolutely. So, again, we spoke earlier, the complaints function probably, creates a lot of this data, but, it needs to get it into the hands of people that can actually do something with it. And I think they do, and they work hard at that. But, the challenge is getting that ownership of it. But without that, and also without business areas working together, there's often an end-to-end process that is owned by, different people, so without getting that data in front of all of those people, then changes are never gonna happen and never gonna last.
Let's come into land. Role and responsibilities. We talked about accountability, certainly in the first and the second line, Kate. But talk to us about board oversight and understanding. And how do firms? Let's be very practical here. What are the hacks and the shortcuts that we can help 900 people on this webinar to be able to navigate? Talking to C-suite, talking to senior managers, and perhaps the SMCR community to say, right, look, we need to actually move this forward faster.
Yeah, I think culturally, this is where the shift needs to happen in terms of that leadership and that engagement. And if that's where firms are struggling, I would bring it down to costs. Say, listen, this is how much it costs to run my department. This is how much it costs in terms of what we're paying out, because you will have a redress that you can quite easily track. And this is how much we could reduce that by if I had greater visibility or access at a more senior level. And it's not, the complaints team sitting at the board every kind of time the board meets. It's making sure you're at the right committee and you've got access to the right individuals to present your data and your findings. And you only need to find one person on that board or that senior management team to push your cause, and that will help in terms of that escalation. But anyone who's kind of got a SMF responsibility, I would also send them and remind them of their reasonable steps that they should be taking as an SMF holder, because complaints is very much at the heart of that, and their ability to review and listen. Those CEOs that I've seen that are great, I've got one CEO who I work with at the moment. He looks at complaints on a regular basis. He'll listen to the calls that generated the complaints, and they'll do a session where they listen to them. And that gives you, the voice of the customer at that board level is all important. And that will help generate that interest in that complaints level.
Don't underestimate what value it can bring, Martin. Complaints handling and also the MI from root cause analysis.
Yeah, and we've spoken for some time as an organisation about how undervalued that is, at how much benefit there is still to be found with analysing and utilising that data and driving action off the back of it. And speaking to Adrian's point earlier in the session around how complaints are seen as a cost centre, it's using that data and insight and taking action off it that we can try and change that perception, and see it as a listening post and a way to actually deliver the outcomes that we want to deliver to customers, and potentially achieve some level of competitive advantage in terms of the service that we deliver to customers as well.
Nice. And there's some companies who are doing that, aren't there, Adrian?
Yeah, I really like Kate's. I'm a businessman at the end of the day, and I ran a business that got almost a record number of complaints, so I know what that actually cost the business, and it was guilty of counting complaints rather than actually assessing the long-term value destruction to that brand of those complaints. I looked at that and thought that was just plain stupidity. Some of our customers have deployed our technology specifically to support their complaints outcomes, and we haven't got time, but you can all read, and I'm going to send you the slides anyway. But I love what LV have done. I love it. They would not have achieved that without exec sponsorship.
Yeah.
Right? So first point, somebody senior in LV said, "This is important to us. We're not just ticking boxes. We're actually, this is the essence of our business. We're going to treat these things seriously, and we're going to treat them as destroyers of value." And it's not just a short-term value. Oh, it cost me, I had to pay them five grand more. That's so short-term thinking. It's like, what's the cost of not paying them and having all the complaints dealt with poorly? It's many multiples of five grand. So I get right on my hobby horse about it. So the competence components, I really think, someone suggested, why don't we have a webinar looking at what they can do about this issue? It's probably, given that we've only got a few minutes, it's probably not a bad idea, because I think between us, we've got some really good ideas as to what firms, and Kate's already suggested some stuff. But for me, it's got to link back to the bottom line. And, Philip, we were talking yesterday, weren't we, about the FCA's guidance in 2021 about culture and what firms should be measuring. Yeah. And for me, complaints is a great litmus test. If you ask your employees, do you think that we genuinely, care about customers who complain, or do you think we manage the data point? I think that is like a massive red flag. And if you did that anonymously in your firm, what do you think your employees are going to say? And judging by the sentiment in the chat, I think a lot of people on this call are going to say, we manage the data point.
Yeah. So let's come into land finally on this, and let's look at basically what do the panelists think and feel that the audience should do next? I mean, we're going to send the slide deck. We're going to ask those challenging questions. Martin, starting off with you, what do firms really need to do to raise their game, tangibly raise their game, so that they can actually embed and adopt what the FCA has prescribed?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I think there's a clear gap analysis exercise that you can undertake, using the insight that's been provided. And then you're just going to have to invest in closing those gaps that are appropriate for your organization. But it's going to take, improving data. It's going to take improving systems. It's certainly going to take improving skill and competency of individuals. So again, there is no silver bullet to this. You're going to have to create a range of actions that will need managing and delivering in order to make a step change from where you are at the moment.
Yeah. Absolutely. And on the screen, you've got an opportunity to reach out and engage with Clever Nelly to improve employee competence, like Adrian said, and address complaint reduction. Also, the opportunity to talk to Martin and his colleagues to review systems and controls, processing complaints and conducting RCA, and then talking to Kate and the Avyse Partners team to review approach to complaint handling and root cause. Final couple of minutes, Kate, a word from you and then followed by yourself, Adrian.
Yeah, I think, I think the number of attendees here today is just a representation of how important this issue is. I think one takeaway, if I were you, is when you get the slides that come through, and I'm sure they will be shared, is there's a challenge yourselves question on each set of slides. I wouldn't just keep that within your own complaints team. I get the business to challenge themselves on that as well, because there's some really, there's some questions in there that are broad, and do a gap analysis on the back of it. Just see, ask yourselves, how much do we really know? How much more do we need to invest? And where do we want to be? Are we at an aspirational level, or are we living our own ideas?
Nice.
I just want to make, someone made a really good point. I think it was, I'm going to name you, Rebecca, because you've been vocal and rightly vocal, and thank you for contributing as you have, around my parlance. You'd be insane as an employee to fill in any sort of survey that criticised the organisation. You know what? I think I agree. So I think if you're filling in survey monkey type things, I am naturally cynical. That's why I've got no hair. Yeah, I would just say, look, there are much smarter ways. For example, in our world, we got 2 levels of confidentiality. One is confidential. I can assure you no one will see it. Yeah. The other is completely anonymous. And as soon as somebody types, it erases. Firstly, I've got one employee. Yeah, I've got like a virtual employee that if anyone traces it back, it goes to some virtual employee who doesn't exist. Everything's shut down. Everything's erased. No one can see it. We can't see it. As soon as they click it, it's done. So I completely understand. I've worked for firms with really toxic culture where managers would stand over employees and have them fill in surveys. See, it's disgraceful. So I know that disgraceful practices exist out there. You need to have robust technology that ensures the anonymity of those employees if you want genuine feedback in your company. And what I see is that firms who've got great cultures, they don't perhaps need that level of certainty because their employees trust them. So it's a slightly vicious circle.
And we haven't picked up on psychological safety or culture of trust. That's another webinar in itself, but super important, Martin, for them to trust the processes, trust the technology, and trust each other.
Yeah, it's a big ask, but yes. Yeah, absolutely right.
I think that 2 minutes to go, and with 45 questions down, or 26 questions plus also 7 questions, unless there's a burning question that you want to address, panelists, from there, we will take these offline.
Yeah.
Timmy Mallet, why are you laughing so much?
Because Rebecca said she's a lot of fun at parties. It's got me giggling. So, well done, Rebecca. Anyway, my final point is, if there's one thing I would say is the way your firm deals with complaints is a direct reflection of the attitude and culture of your leadership team.
Oh, hello.
Well, I've sat on it. I've done it, Philip. I've been there. Yeah. And you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to use that on the dinner table. Yeah.
Oh, Rebecca. She goes to lots of parties.
And the kids were like that when they... Yeah. Dad, your culture of this house is a direct...
Doesn't work with parents. They're exempt.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.